All right. So I think the best place to start off would be I mean, obviously we know who you are, but just for the camera, like who you are, where you were born, who your parents were, just kind of like background stuff. Where were you from? That sort
Yeah,
of thing.
okay. Ralph Brooks is my name. I was born in Niagara Falls, Ontario, Canada, and I had my father's name was Roland, my mother's name was Eva, and I had a brother and a sister older, and my brother was younger.
Mm-hmm.
And we lived on a very small farm that was always a challenge to make ends meet. So, but we had a good upbringing. My dad, my mom were very strong Christians.
Mm-hmm.
They believed in God to the fullest. They believed in reading the Bible and having a prayer every evening after our meal. And we would, all five of us, we would find ourselves in the living room where Dad had read a little scripture, and then we would kneel down. That was a necessity on his part, that we would kneel down before our Lord.
Wow.
And that's always stuck with me.
Uh-huh.
That was very much a given thing.
Uh-huh.
So I attended school. It was called SS number 4, Stanford Center, about 4 miles from Niagara Falls. And that's where we had farm property, and that's where things would happen, because my dad was very adventurous, like building houses and doing things on the farm, making our own equipment and automatic spray equipment. That's where I learned to drive the car. Actually, it was a small tractor where my dad had a 1-furrow plow.
Mm-hmm.
And he puts me in the seat. Really thing that I didn't see it coming, where he was going to put me in the seat and I was going to drive this tractor to help him plow the dirt. And he says, just get your eye on something down there and don't turn away from it. Well, by the time I got to the end of what we call the furrow, well, I looked back and there it was all over the place. But I got to learn how to handle the tractor, because I ended up, that was my job, we had an automatic tractor with a plow, two furrow plow. You know, that was interesting growing up. Yeah.
What kind of things did you grow on the farm?
Oh, that was first off, the little farm wrapped around an old English church. And this English church had a cemetery. And our farm wrapped around the cemetery and the church. And when we were growing up, my sister, myself, and my brother, and the neighbors, we all used to play hide and seek in the cemetery. And could never scare each of us. We lived beside it for so many years, and it was an interesting. We would lay down on our back and look up to the stars, and there was very few lights around there at that time. So that your question was, what kind of fruit and vegetables did we grow? Being that it was different seasons, that meant that the fruit trees that we had to be able to what was known as being able to season, except the frost, the total freezing of the ground. So that was fruit like peaches, pears, plums, apples, cherries. Those were trees that we had, we owned 14 and a half acres, and about half of that was all in trees. And then there was other fruit such as raspberries and strawberries, blueberries. They were all fruit that had to be looked after in the wintertime. We used to have to cut out the old bush and allow the new bush to come up. And it was somewhat of a challenge in the freezing of the winter just to go out and prune the trees. Yeah. So that primarily it was also one of my jobs to, when the fruit was picked, we would have a little stand at the side of the road for people to stop and buy. But it was also another job that I was to go door to door with the fruit and sell the fruit that we would pick. And it was a job that wasn't necessarily a likable job. It was something we had to do. My mother didn't care for the farm. She never had that kind of bringing up when she was a child.
What was her bringing up like?
Oh boy. First off, my mother was originally from Yorkshire, England. And she was the last of the three girls to leave the house, being the fact that her mom and her dad, my grandparents, they passed away. But my mother had the challenge when she was 6 years of age. She was in the child labor law that was very strong in England. And she was one of these young ones that had to go to work because there was no support from the government for my grandparents. And my grandfather, he had a challenge due to the fact that he worked as a striker. Well, what's a striker? A striker is at the blast furnace where the iron would come out from the furnace and it would have to be shaped, and it would be his job with the red burning hot iron. That was his job, so consequently he would get the dust from the iron, and that's what he died from, was the dust at the age of 45.
Wow.
And I don't know what the age my grandmother passed away, but when they both passed away, my mother was still working. She had the challenge of going to work at 6 in the morning, and don't forget now she was 6 years old, and she worked till noon. They had one break in the morning, but she was standing on a wooden box so that she could reach the little levers that she was supposed to operate this machine with. And how was this little girl going to learn how to operate these knitting mill machines? Well, I guess they have faith that it would happen, and sure enough, she would work till 12 o'clock noon, and at 1 o'clock, between the 12, she would have lunch. Then she would go to school, and she'd go from 1 o'clock to 6 o'clock to school.
Wow.
And then she'd come home. Well, when her mom and dad died, she was still working at that same mill. She, in fact, had advanced to the point where she was supervision over most of the girls that were working there. And she had had enough, and she decided she was going to leave England, of which she proceeded to do this, and she got on a boat at Liverpool, England, and she set sail. I guess it was quite a large boat, and she was heading to Montreal, Canada, in Quebec. The unfortunate was that as soon as she lost sight of land, she started getting seasick.
Wow.
And she was seasick till she got where she could see land over in Canada, Newfoundland, and finally landed at Montreal. Well, she took a train to Toronto, and then she took a train to St. Catharines. Now you have to know that this was a very timid lady, because there was nothing other than work that she was used to, didn't have too many friends, and so she was on her way to Australia, where her parents, as well as herself, have relations from the family who lived in Australia. And that's where she was headed. She had a sister who lived in Canada, a little town called St. Catharines, not far from Niagara Falls. And during the course of her visit there, her and her sister go to Niagara Falls to visit an old friend that they knew in England that was living in Niagara Falls. So, being at that particular time, lo and behold, who shows up but my dad. They had no connection, had no idea, but my dad had an uncle that owned a house, and that's where he was living at. And he sees this young lady who he thought was new because he had never seen her before. And he was bold enough to go and introduce himself and find out where she's from. Well, my dad was very much full of fun enjoyed life, and he liked, I guess, what he saw. So he very boldly asked her if he could take her home. And her sister was with her, so he gets on this old streetcar, and it's just a wobbly old streetcar down the streetcar tracks, and it's 12 miles away. And sure enough, they get to liking each other, and he's on the track going to St. Catharines to visit her different times. Well, he decided that this was the one that he'd like to be married to, and he asked her to if she would be his wife, and I don't know how she said yes, but that was the outcome, because she and the two of them, they got married at 3 months later. And a year later, they had my sister. 3 years after her, they had me. And then 5 years after that, they had my younger brother. Mm-hmm. So that's somewhat of the bit of the history of my dad, my mom, and of course my dad was very active. Unfortunately, he didn't have a whole lot of education, and so I grew up in the old time, the Depression years, which was very, very difficult, very difficult. There was the line of men that didn't have work. They would go every morning to get in this line to get what the government was passing out. And it could be like bread, it could be milk, it could be many different things. Well, my dad did that for a short length of time, and he says, I can't stand this, I can't handle it, and he says, I got to do something. Well, the story that he told me, he says, I had 25 cents in my pocket, and I went to a farmer and I bought all the green vegetables I could for a quarter. Now, you have to know a quarter was worth $25 then. So he starts with all the green vegetables that he bought, going door to door selling what he had bought. And when he'd sell out, he'd go back and buy some more. Well, he did this long enough that the corner store got a little nervous that they were being, someone else was selling the products and not them. Well, that did very well. He was able to buy an old truck, and it was a Model T truck, one that Ford had built, and it was three brake and clutch, and it was one that if you went down a hill, you better be full of gas to get back up the hill, because it was just gravity feed of gas. And I'd been in that truck when he didn't have a full tank of gas. We'd have to turn around and back up all the way then the hill. And remembering that quite rememberably, that he was very much a gentleman that would try anything. He was a carpenter, mechanic, but the most thing that he loved was he just loved the Lord. His time of spending on his knees praying One of the things I remember was that he had prayed and prayed for his children, where the old saying was, well, I have prayed through for my children, and I know they're going to be saved. That was a statement of the old Christians that were just prayer warriors. So, yeah, I love my dad very much. I look forward to being with him in heaven.
So you grew up in the Free Methodist Church, right?
Yes, I did.
So what was that like? What was the experience of the Methodism of then versus like kind of Christianity of today?
Well, Free Methodist, as I recall when I was growing up, had what they called the 2 works of grace. One was where God would forgive you of your sins, but you still had another work of grace, and that was called sanctification. And this was a very, very strong denominational belief. We had churches all over the United States and Canada. We had one bishop in Canada, and I think 2 or 3 in the United States. And the headquarters was Winona Lake, Indiana. And the bishop would come about once every 3 months and have a real good revival time. And this is where the word would be preached, and where fire and brimstone would be preached and taught. And I remember those days very, very well, where you would just stand on an invitation, even though you had already given your heart to the Lord. You were standing there shaking because of what they would preach so strongly on hell. And it was a time of loving my church family, enjoyed church in itself, Sunday school. We had Wednesday night class meeting. Friday night was prayer meeting, and the class session was where the class leader would be coming to each one of the members of the church that would come to that meeting that night, and the class leader would go and individually ask the individual, how is your life, and how is your walk with the Lord? Tell me what's going on. Now I gotta tell you, my dad was that class leader, and he was the one that would ask the questions. Brother, have you been keeping up with your prayers? Have you been keeping up with reading your scriptures, the Bible? Have you been listening to the Lord and doing what He's asked? Those were questions that the class leader asked. And my dad being for many years, you had to be voted in by the church to have that responsibility. He was very well liked in the church. He was respected as one of the main men of the church. He had what was known as a license to, it was called the exhorter's license. And that would give him the right next to the pastor. And my dad had a very strong following of the Lord.
Wow.
His walk with the Lord was just impeccable. Many's and many's of services after the preacher had stopped preaching and was stopped the exhortation of the ones offering them to come to the altar and give their heart to the Lord. Well, my dad had a foot that he couldn't control, and it would start to tap while the preacher was preaching and exhortation was given. And when the preacher was done, most generally when that foot was tapping, he told me many times, Ralph, he says, I just had to get up. I had to do what the Spirit of the Lord was telling me. And he would get up and he would walk across the front of the church where the altar was. And he would be crying with such feeling for the young people of the church. And he would say, young people, this is real. I remember that. I remember when there was, at least a half a dozen men of my church that were so strong in their worship to the Lord. They would just come Friday night for prayer meeting, and before they would finish praying, you could just feel the pressure of the Lord on them. They would just start groaning. And it was a thing for me to remember where I come from. Now, when we had probably 100 in that church, I remember when Depression years were, and that the church was trying to pay for the mortgage. Well, it was very likely that all that you're going to get every Sunday, they took a special offering, and it would be nickels and dimes and quarters. And that's how they got the money to pay for the mortgage on that church. Now, I and my dad became very strongly directed, I believe, through the Lord, that he wanted our church to be much larger in size, the building. So we started promoting this, and about 3 or 4 years into that promoting, they started thinking, well, maybe it would be good for us to get into a bigger church. And we started looking for a piece of property which was about 5 miles away from the church itself where we were worshiping. And lo and behold, we got a new piece of property, and we built the parsonage first, and that was Uncle Ken's project that he was looking after to build. And then about 2 or 3 years after the parsonage, they were able to come up with the idea of building up the new church. So we got an architect and we got it drawn up, and they elected yours truly to be the superintendent of building the new church. And that was really an honor for the people that I had known all my life. They thought I had enough capabilities of doing this, which we did, and I think you remember seeing it a few years ago on a trip back there. Yeah.
So, your dad was like was a really good Christian and everything like that. Do you think he got some of that from his parents, or was there like a spiritual history?
Very much so. Very much so.
What were his parents like?
I was only a year old when my grandmother passed away, and my grandfather had already passed away. But my dad had a mother who believed very strongly of the faith in God, and she played the organ of the church where they attended. But where they attended was like about 250 miles straight north of Niagara Falls, which was the very, very cold area, especially cold. And my dad, through circumstances, decided he would leave that area and come and live with his uncle in Niagara Falls. So Dad was raised to be a Christian boy, and both his sisters were very strong Christian. All the family, all ones that I had as my relatives, were all very much Christians. Yeah.
Wow. So, do you know why they lived way up in the north there? Was there some, where did they come from kind of before, and what made them settle in that area?
That's a very good question. It's going to take a little bit of explanation. My grandmother lived in Niagara Falls with her brother, and she had never gotten married. She was reading the paper, and she also didn't have a job. And she saw where there was a gentleman who had several boys, but lost his wife, and he was looking for someone to be a housekeeper. So she answered that, and he thought he'd give her a try, so he sent her money to travel up there. Now, my grandmother was the only girl of about 7 brothers. So she left all the brothers and went to Bracebridge, it's called, where my dad was, Dad's family started. And she became the housekeeper, but she also became his wife. And I'm not sure, I think it was like a year or so that she had been doing all the housework and cooking and so forth. So my dad is the middle of three children, of which is the second family of my grandfather. The first family had like 7 brothers and the one girl. The second family had, as I say, Dad and the 2 sisters. And my dad had asthma real bad. So the doctor told him it'd be wise for him to move out of the real cold area and to try an area that's damp, of which is Niagara Falls, because of the spray and all the, it's wet frequently there. So that's where he moved to, that's where he stayed, that's where he died, that's where he was buried. And between him and I, as well as my brother, we built several houses together, and through that process I became a carpenter, and I made my living at that for my family, and I was very much involved with the building industry in Niagara Falls. I was a member of the union for a few years, and that's where I got involved with the project called the International Skyline Tower, and that's where I was involved for 18 months building this tower and buildings around it. And then I get another big job, long time project in the Ontario Hydro project, but I got hurt, and I ended up in a hospital and was there for about 19-20 days. It allowed me to rest for a while. Insurance was covering all expenses, and so going back to work, I get a job through the union again, and that was to build a 14-story hotel right in the Niagara Falls area. And I finished that, and then had a few other projects, and my brother and I decided that we would put Brooks Brothers Construction Company together, and we did that for a few years. And then my daughter Karen was living in California, and we came to visit with her one Christmas and realized what kind of weather was happening here. When I was at home, I was in the wintertime having to work in all the cold, and when it was summertime, it was just very humid, hot, and I enjoyed what I saw here, and that's how I made up my mind to move to California.
Wow. So you were born in Canada, and now you're here in California. Was there any like learning curves or anything different here in California, like from California, just from Canada, besides the weather?
Just the recognizing that there was no snow at Christmas time. Mm-hmm. The first year it felt so strange being celebrating Christmas without snow. was one thing. The other thing was working where I didn't have to find myself in the cold
Oh.
working. Most of my jobs were, I was hired on as superintendent.
Mhm.
That's what I went out to do.
Wow.
So I did some pretty remarkable projects. Yeah, slip form operations. But then my two boys, Richard and Peter, they also liked the carpentry, and Rick is still very strongly involved with the construction. Peter, he's retired
Mhm.
and is enjoying retirement.
Yeah.
But not a whole lot of difference. Just the fact that, man, I don't have to face. Let me give you a little information on about what it was like to work out in the cold. First off, you'd have to put on silk underwear. Silk was to really keep you warm. Then you had a pair of pants, and sometimes you'd even leave your pajamas on if it got extra cold. And you'd have your regular pants, your overalls, then your top jacket. That was, and then you wrapped around that your apron, and just underneath that you had a bib overall. So when you come home at night, you had if the spray from the falls had gone all over the city, it would land on whatever.
Wow.
And your clothes was quite often, and it would freeze on you.
Mhm.
So you'd end up taking your overalls off and standing them up against the furnace, and just watch them slowly thaw out.
Wow.
But your teeth also would feel like they're froze. It would take almost an hour for them to thaw out in the house.
So were they just numb, or?
Yes,
Wow.
yes. I remember that very much so. Yeah.
So when you were building, when you were like building houses and stuff, did you, and you know you had a long career in construction, did you see safety codes like kind of get better as you went along? Like were there lots of dangerous things in early
Yeah, they
construction?
got to the point where what we called tailgate meetings.
Hmm.
And these were the men on the job. That way we would just literally stop the job and gather around, and the office would usually give us, okay, we want you to cover such and such today.
Mm-hmm.
And it was done more so in the latter 10 years of my involvement with the industry of construction. Yeah.
Wow. Oh, do you have kind of a favorite construction project that you did over the years?
Well, that's kind of hard to. After I built the Skyline Tower, I told you that we built a church for my congregation. During that period of time, there was a pastor from Niagara Falls in U.S. that was interested in what I was doing. They wanted to build a new church, so they came to ask me if I would be interested in building their church when I got finished with. And I said, well, I never thought about that. I just thought about going back to the regular union jobs, and so I said we'd think about it, and that gave me. I had to stop being involved with the union because I was going to be the manager of the church for the Free Methodist Church in North Tonawanda. And so we had problems with the union. And that's another story in itself. The union and the union president and, out of Buffalo, New York. I think that the changes of you just had to be smart when you're handling products of what it was that you were working with. If you were an old-time carpenter or rod buster or a steel worker or plumbing, any one of those trades, you knew what to expect because you'd been down that road many a time. You knew what could happen. And if you had some young guys on, you'd have to teach them and show them what could happen. I remember building a house out in Malibu after I retired from managing another company. I had another guy working with me, and then I had hired Rick, my son, and he moved out from New York. And the very first day we were lifting a beam in place, and of course we all had our hard hats in place, and the beam got dropped and it hit me on the head, knocked my hard hat off, and gave me a concussion. And that led to being, okay, what happened? Why did that happen? And things just got out of hand, and, which wasn't supposed to. So safety first is definitely always been the first thing that you would on a job, man. Because the Skyline Tower that I was on, they expected 3 men to get killed.
Wow.
By the insurance company.
Wow.
And then that didn't happen, but there was a lot of the guys got hurt. There was just all kinds of accidents. broken arms and dislocated shoulders and gearboxes that had the hydraulics. Wintertime, the guys were wearing gloves, and the glove got caught in the gear, and his hand went right through
Wow.
the gears. And here it was wintertime. And another time with a safety problem, the guy had just snapped his safety belt on, and he slipped on the working platform, and then it had black ice, and you couldn't see ice, and he slipped, and there was a void between the vertical tower and the working platform, and he slid and went down.
Wow.
And tested his safety belt, and he could have landed on the ground, and we were up probably about 400 feet at that time. Yeah.
What?
So a lot of stupid. You ask about this kind of thing. Most accidents are just carelessness, and that's the first thing we have to pay attention to. Yeah.
So when you were working and there were all these accidents and they expected 3 people to die on the job, how did that affect you?
Well, I was superintendent, foreman.
So you were.
I had to make sure that the guys were
Okay.
working safely,
Uh-huh.
and we did that. But you couldn't control everything that was. The guy that had his glove on, his glove got too close to the gears, and it just sucked him in.
Wow.
Along with that, just sucked his fingers in.
Wow.
Yeah. But we were pouring concrete on that job in the middle of winter, and it was a project that required 5% calcium chloride to keep the concrete from freezing. But you couldn't do that with your fingers. So, but that was one of my most interesting jobs. I was the last one on that job. Let me tell you a little secret that happened to me. I had been living in California, and I took my wife Lillian back to Niagara Falls to give her a tour of Niagara Falls and the tower and so forth. As we were approaching the base of the tower, I noticed a gentleman standing, which was close to the back and the rear of the tower where maintenance and that was being occupied, and I just happened to call to the guy, to talk to him for a minute, and I said, "How long have you been working on this tower?" Well, I received the keys from the guy that built it, and he said that he had been there ever since it opened up.
Wow.
And I told him, I said, "I was the guy that gave you the keys." That was so
Wow.
unbelievable.
Wow.
And we just looked at each other for a few minutes, and then he started telling me all about what he knew about the tower.
Uh-huh.
And I was telling him what it was like building it. So that was quite a, and here's my wife standing back and wondering, wow, that's very, very interesting that you would actually, you know, the thing is about pretty close to 50 years anniversary right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow.
No.
So.
But it's a great place to go and enjoy your meal in the evening on the top of the one of the first floor is where the dining room is, of which that dining room platform revolves on the tower once every hour. So you can see 360 degrees for that hour that you're enjoying your dinner.
Wow. What?
And what you can see is mostly lights. And you know where the lights are because you know where the town is. 75 miles away is quite a distance. I could see, you can see Buffalo from there, which is like 20 miles. You could see Toronto, which is across the lake, is about 40 miles. But you could just on the horizon see the lights, the night lights of Toronto.
Wow.
And yeah, it was the guys that I worked with after we finished building it. Man, I wish we had another one to go and build right away. They didn't, but it was a funny thing. Periodically, we needed more carpenters. So we would call for them at the union, and they would come down, get on the elevator, which was what we call a material hoist, man hoist combination. So they would get on, and they would ride up to wherever the slip form was moving, and probably 50% of them would not get off the elevator because it was too high, too dangerous, and just not something that they would want to do.
Mm-hmm.
So periodically, though, we had to walk from the base to the top because the elevator would stop working, and we'd have to climb on the stairway all the way up.
Wow. And how tall was it?
550 feet.
Wow.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. It's not the tallest. It was pretty much parallel with a lot of towers around. But so we've enjoyed. I've enjoyed my life.
mm-hmm.
I probably like to say that at my age that I am, which is 87, I every day walk with the Lord. Every day I try to read the scriptures. And every day I pray. And I feel that there's nothing in this old world that has any value other than that God has forgiven me of my many, many sins.
Uh-huh.
He's been good to me. When I wasn't walking with him, he was there with just being with me.
Uh-huh.
And but it's a great feeling to know that if tomorrow was my passing, I know where I'm going. I know that God's got me lined up. I don't know when only He knows when my days are finished.
Mm-hmm.
But in having a father and mother, aunts and uncles that were all Christians, that's just the way I was brought up.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thankful that I have my 3 sons, my 2 grandsons, granddaughter, and just granddaughters and grandsons that are all living and following the Lord. It's such a good feeling. There's nothing like having the knowledge of knowing your sins are forgiven and know that you're on your way to heaven and that God is your Savior. God is the one that looks after you. That you don't have to worry about nothing but just getting up in the morning and, well, I usually spend about an hour reading, and it's such a good time.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, plus more so.
You have 7 minutes left.
Okay. Okay. So it looks like we have 7 minutes left. We don't have to use all of that time, but is there anything else, like any stories, anything like that you also wanted to share?
Okay. One of the stories that my dad and myself involves, and I was about, I think I was probably about 13 probably,
Mm-hmm.
and I enjoyed playing baseball. And I used to play for the school that one of the positions I played was pitching, and I could usually hit a pretty good ball, quite often a home run. But my dad didn't know that I was doing this. I was supposed to get home, and getting home was to get and work on the farm, because there was always lots to do. Well, I was on the mound and I was pitching, and here comes this Model A Ford down the road. Who was in it but my dad? And my dad was pretty good with the whip when I did things wrong. He did pretty good. His belt was used frequently. Well, I knew I was going to get it because I wasn't home. I wasn't working on the farm. And he came to get me, and I went to the coach who was the principal of the school. And I still remember his name. His name was Mr. Kirkby. And I went to him and I says, I'm going to have to leave. And I was standing on, and I was pitching to the other team. He says, what do you mean you got to leave? I said, well, my dad's coming down the road, and I know that I'm going to get it because he has a need for me on the farm. And he says, well, let me go talk with him. So he stops the game, and all these kids, from the other school that we were playing against was there, and he goes and talks to my dad, and he comes back and he says, you can finish the game. And I've persuaded him to stay and watch you play. Well, I couldn't believe it. Because my dad, he couldn't catch a ball. He didn't know what sports was about. He didn't really care about anything like that. Anyhow, I finished pitching that inning, and it was my turn to come up to bat, I think about the first or second of that inning. But in my mind, I gotta hit a ball. I gotta show my dad that I can hit a ball, play baseball. And so I grabbed what I thought was the biggest bat that I could get a hold of. And I remember swinging, and I had 2 strikes. I don't know how many balls I had, but I knew I had to get the next one. Sure enough, I hit that ball and it started to go. And it took off and went over the fence. It was a home run, and I think there were 1 or 2 on base. And he was so thrilled. When I got in the truck to go home, he smiled and he says, "You really like to play ball?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "Well, when that time comes, you play ball, but when you're finished, you get home because you're needed at home on the farm." And I said, "You really mean that?" And he says, "Yeah." He says, "I'd like you to enjoy playing ball." So for my best friend was the pastor's son of Methodist Church. And he used to catch for me, and I used to pitch just each day in recess. That's what we would do. Pitch and catch, pitch and catch. It was an enjoyable time. The other little thing that we did in school was play alleys. And that's where you had a great big alley, and you'd sit on the concrete floor with your legs out, and you'd have maybe 10 guys at the other end with little alleys rolling at that big one to see if they could get it. And all these little alleys were coming in. We played that in the wintertime. And once in a while the principal would come down and he'd play with us. And he'd take what he'd win too. Yeah, so I think we've had a good time talking, and I look forward to seeing and being around for many years, just seeing my 2 of my favorite grandsons grow, be great guys, enjoy their life, and whatever God has for them. That's what I look forward to.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this.
Well, I count it a real privilege and honor to be sitting here with my grandson.
It's great to be sitting here with you. Thank you.
Yeah, great time.
Thank you.
Well, I guess Dad thinks it's time to...
He said there were only 7 minutes left, so I don't know where